Ever get that feeling, where you think something's going to be a total drag, and then, boom, it blows your mind?
Okay, yeah, I get it.
That's Leviticus for me. I mean, Leviticus.
Yeah, it's funny how it's got that reputation, right? Like, Old Testament laws, gotta be boring. But man, there's some wild stuff in there.
Seriously.
Yeah.
We're talking full-on treasure buried in the backyard. So today, we're diving deep, deep into Leviticus. And I'm not talking about just scratching the surface. We're going way beyond the don't do this and don't do that.
Right, gotta get past all that surface.
We're digging into the good stuff. Holiness, sacrifice, even that whole Day of Atonement thing.
Yeah, the Day of Atonement. See, now we're talking. That's where things get really interesting. And what's amazing is how these themes, they still resonate, even after all these years.
Hundreds of years.
Yeah.
It's wild.
It's like this direct line to understanding, like, the core relationship between God and the Israelites. And spoiler alert, it matters a lot for us today.
Huge implications.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's break this down a bit. First up, holiness. It's everywhere in Leviticus. It's like the backbone of the whole book.
Totally. You pretty much can't miss it. But here's the thing about holiness. It's not just about being, good or following a checklist of rules.
Okay, so what is it then?
One way to think about it, and this really hit home for me when I was reading this one source, it described it as being set apart, reflecting, like, God's character, but not just in some parts of life, like in everything you do.
It's less about checking boxes and more like your whole life is different.
You got it.
Wow.
It's all about how you're treating people, your family, the people you work with, even that jerk who cut you off in traffic this morning.
Oh, man, tell me about it.
It's like how you handle your money, how you spend your free time, literally everything. It's all connected.
So we're talking like a full-on life makeover Leviticus style, aligning your entire life with what God values.
Think of it as a guidebook, not just a rule book. And sure, some of those rules, they might seem a bit, old-fashioned to us now.
Just a bit.
But those principles underneath, timeless. I mean, seriously, they just don't get old.
Okay, speaking of old, those sacrifices, that whole sacrificial system in Leviticus, I'm not going to lie, that's a tough one for my modern brain to wrap itself around.
Like, tell me about it. It's
And
like,
like-
wait, what are they doing? Why? It can be a lot.
It's a lot.
But for a second, try to see it from their point of view, For the Israelites, sacrifices weren't about blindly following rules. It was all about, like, maintaining that connection, that relationship.
Okay, I'm listening. What do you mean by that?
Okay, so every offering, every single one, whether it was a burnt offering, a sin offering, whatever, it had a specific purpose.
Like a spiritual reason behind it.
Well, exactly. And it wasn't always pretty, They were acknowledging they messed up. They were asking for forgiveness. They were trying to get right with God.
So it wasn't really about, like, the animal itself. It was more about what it represented.
You got it. Seeking that reconciliation.
Wow. It's a lot deeper than you think when you first read it.
Right.
Which brings us to maybe the most intense day on the entire Jewish calendar.
Oh, man, here we go. The big one.
The Day of Atonement. Yom Kippur.
Heavy stuff.
This was the day the high priest, the Holy of Holies.
The most sacred spot in the whole temple.
And he's in there, offering sacrifices not just for himself, for everyone, for the entire nation. Can you imagine the pressure?
Oh, man, that's a lot of pressure. Think about it. Carrying the weight of everyone's sin on your shoulders, literally begging for forgiveness on their behalf. It's heavy.
Talk about a burden.
I mean, it really makes you think, doesn't it? It makes you think about how serious sin is in the eyes of, a God who's perfectly holy. But it also shows you how merciful he is, how much he wants to give us a way back, a clean slate.
It's like this powerful image of grace. They weren't guaranteed forgiveness, not at all. But God, out of his goodness, he made a way for them to be cleansed, to have that fresh start.
And this, my friend, this is where things get really, really interesting, especially for us.
As Christians.
You got it. You see, the Day of Atonement, it's like a sneak peek. It's foreshadowing something even bigger.
Wait a minute, you're talking about skatebird?
Jesus.
Whoa.
He is the fulfillment, everything the sacrificial system was pointing toward.
Hold on. So all those rituals, all those offerings, they were leading up to Jesus' sacrifice on the cross.
That's what I'm saying.
That's a lot to unpack.
It is. And it changes everything. We can look back and see what it all meant. The depth of his sacrifice. I mean, think about it. Jesus becomes the ultimate high priest. He is the perfect sacrifice. He even takes on the role of the scapegoat. taking all the sin of the world on himself.
Wow. I have to admit, when we decided to do this Leviticus deep dive, I never imagined it would get so
Shem.
intense. Yeah. And theologically rich. I mean, we went from ancient rituals to the core of Christianity in like, what, 20 minutes?
That's the beauty of Leviticus, right? It's so much more than just a bunch of dusty old rules. It's all connected to holiness, sacrifice, and God's love for his people.
So much more. We've got holiness, sacrifices pointing to Jesus, that intense day of atonement. But it seems like there's more to it than just the big picture stuff.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Like there's got to be a practical side to it all, right?
Oh, absolutely. This isn't some pie-in-the-sky theology. It's about the everyday stuff, the nitty-gritty of how to live a holy life, practically speaking.
Okay, so let's get down to it then. Give me an example.
Check out Leviticus 19. It's basically a crash course on ethical living. We're talking honesty in business, taking care of the poor, the people who are struggling, that sort of thing.
Wait a minute. Honesty. Caring for the poor. Those aren't exactly the first things that come to mind when I hear Leviticus. It sounds more like, well, just being a decent person. Basic kindness.
And that's the point. Those things matter. Loving your neighbor, being fair, showing compassion, it's all woven into Leviticus. And you know what? They're just as relevant today as they were way back then.
It's crazy, right? Like something written thousands of years ago could still be so spot on about how we live now.
Yeah, it really makes you think about, what really changes? Deep down, people are still people.
Totally. We've got the same hang-ups, wanting more, thinking only about ourselves, looking for the easy way out. But it's kind of comforting, in a way, to see Leviticus calling it out. Like, hey, I know you're going to mess up, but here's how to get back on track. Here's how to make things right.
Exactly. It's not about being perfect. Nobody's perfect. It's more about trying day after day to live in a way that shows who God is, what he cares about.
So getting back to that whole holiness thing, it's deeper than just not doing certain things. It's like an attitude, a way of looking at the world.
Yeah, it's like aligning your heart, your mind, everything you do with what God wants. Becoming more like him.
And becoming more like him, that's where those priests come in, right?
Right.
The ones in Leviticus. They were super important in making that connection with God happen.
Oh, for sure. The priests were like the go-betweens, the bridge between God and everybody else.
So they were like spiritual liaisons.
Yeah, exactly. They did it, all the sacrifices, making sure the temple was holy, teaching people about God's laws.
Wow, that's a lot. Like a spiritual advisor, a ritual expert, and a teacher all rolled into one. Intense.
No kidding. Talk about pressure. But what's really interesting is how Leviticus shows us that even the priests, these guys who are supposed to be the best of the best, they messed up too.
You're thinking of Nadab and Abihu, right?
Those are the ones?
Aaron's sons.
Mm.
Offering up that unauthorized fire, not a good move on their part.
Nope, not at all. And it's like this big warning sign, reminding everyone that approaching God, it's serious business. You need that reverence, obedience. You got to respect the rules.
Something we could all use a reminder of sometime.
Okay.
But it does make you wonder, if back then the priests were the ones who bridged the gap between God and everyone else, where does that leave us? I mean, we don't have a temple to go to, no designated priests anymore.
And that, my friend, is the beauty of it all. The new covenant changes everything. Like Peter said, we're all part of a royal priesthood now.
Okay, time out. Royal priesthood. What does that even mean for, like, regular people living now?
It means we don't need that middleman anymore, not like before. We've
Yeah.
got Jesus. He's the ultimate high priest. He opened up the way for us to connect with God directly.
So I could just go
Yeah.
straight to God. No need for a priest to do it for me.
You got it. We're talking direct access. And not just that, we're called to represent him to everyone else, like ambassadors for his love, his grace, his holiness. And we're kind of like those Old Testament priests, just in a totally different way.
Wow, that's a powerful way to think about it. But if we're all priests now, if we're supposed to reflect God's holiness to everyone, that feels like a lot of pressure.
It is a lot, no doubt. But here's the thing. We're not aiming for perfection, not even close. We're going to mess up. We're going to fall short. That's just part of being human. And that's where God's grace steps in.
So it's a journey then. We keep learning, keep growing, and lean on God to help us do what we can't do on our own.
Exactly. You said it perfectly. And even though some of the rules and rituals in Leviticus might seem strange now, those principles underneath, those are as relevant as ever. They point us toward a life of holiness, love, justice, and really getting to know God.
You know, when we started this deep dive, I had no idea Leviticus would be so
So deep.
deep, yeah, and so full of good stuff. It's not just some old rule book. It's way more than that.
It's true. It really makes you think, what else have I missed?
For real.
Yeah.
Okay, but before we get totally off track, I have one big question that's been bugging me this whole time. So we've been talking about Leviticus as this guidebook, right? This blueprint for holy living reflecting God's character. But what does that even look like now?
Yeah.
It's not like we're offering up animals or building temples these days. So how do we take all this ancient stuff and actually live it out?
Man, that is the question, isn't it? And I don't think there's one right answer. But maybe instead of getting hung up on the outward stuff, like the rituals, we should be asking, what were those rituals supposed to do in the first place?
So less about checking off boxes and more about what's going on in our hearts, right?
Exactly, like those sacrifices, for example. It wasn't about the animal, not really. It was about recognizing you need forgiveness, that you're messed up. And it pointed to Jesus, the perfect sacrifice.
So instead of bringing a lamb to the temple, it's more like we offer ourselves to God, like a living sacrifice.
Now you're talking. It's letting God change us from the inside out, making us more loving, more compassionate, more concerned about justice.
Yeah, okay, that clicks. But what about all those other laws? The ones about food, clothes, how you do business. Do those even matter anymore?
Well, that's where it gets a little tricky. It's important to remember we're not under those old covenant laws anymore. Jesus brought in the new covenant, and that changes everything. It's all about grace now.
So we can just ignore all those rules.
Not so fast. Just because we don't have to follow them to the letter doesn't mean they're irrelevant. It's good to ask yourself, like, okay, what's the big idea here? What was God trying to teach his people? Take those dietary laws, for instance. Yeah, they're about what you eat, but it's bigger than that. It was about being set apart, pure, holy, different from everyone else. They were God's chosen people, right?
So even now, we can ask ourselves, what does it mean for me to live a set-apart life? To be different, to be holy, even if it doesn't involve the exact same rules.
Exactly. It might mean being careful about what you're watching, listening to, putting into your mind and body, or how you act at work, how you treat people. Are you honest and fair? How are you using your money, your time, your resources? Are you helping those in need, fighting for what's right?
So it's like taking the heart of those ancient laws and finding creative ways to live them out now.
You got it. Let those principles shape you, your character, your choices. It's about how you interact with the world, with everyone and everything around you.
This deep dive has been amazing. I mean, we started off thinking Leviticus was just a bunch of dusty old rules, but it's so much more. It's like this incredible guidebook for living a life that's actually like full of holiness, full of purpose.
Isn't it wild what happens when you're willing to dig a little deeper? God's word, it never gets old.
It really doesn't. And even though we've been focusing on Leviticus, it all comes back to Jesus, doesn't it? He's the key to it all.
He is.
Well, that about wraps up our deep dive on Leviticus. But before we go, I want to leave you with a question. If holiness is about aligning your heart, your mind, your entire life with God, what's one thing, just one, you can do today to live a holier life? Think about it. And until next time, keep digging.